Be warned, the following contains graphic descriptions and situations not suitable to all audiences. In addition to the usual fare, this program frequently discusses manipulation, violence, death, sex, negative stereotypes, and a surprising amount of regurgitation. Listener discretion is advised. Knowing his friend Harry Houdini mourned the death of his mother deeply, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle referred him to his favorite medium, arguably the best in England. To the offer, Harry was skeptical. In the 7 years since her passing, Houdini had turned once or twice to the occult in hopes of making contact again. But all he found were phonies, using the same tricks he employed as a magician to bilk the gullible and the grief-stricken. As a result, he became the seedy industry's worst nightmare, exposing as many as he could. Still, Conan Doyle assured him that this medium was the best, so Houdini didn't argue. Instead, he promised to attend with an open mind. As he agreed, he and his wife Bess attended, but came away unimpressed. No matter how hard he tried, he just didn't feel his mother's presence, not even a semblance of it. Even from a performance angle, the medium was disappointing. There had been no private details, no mentions particular to he or Bess at all. Heaven was described from an overly Christian perspective, even though his mother was Jewish. And during the entire seance, his mother spoke English, in spite of the fact she never spoke the language a day in her life. She's not convincing, Houdini wrote in his journal. Simply kept talking in general. All this ridiculous stuff. When writing to his friend, he was more delicate. Houdini described the encounter as interesting and tried to avoid the subject. Being frank wouldn't get him anywhere. He knew the famous author was a diehard spiritualist. No amount of reason would sway him. And he was right. When the more brutal elements of his critique became known, Conan Doyle explained it all away. At one point, he even suggested his mother learned English in heaven, clueless as to how ridiculous it sounded. Naturally, he was offended. He assumed the seance would ease Houdini's doubt and open his eyes to the exciting new faith. Instead, he saw the magician's crusade only increase. In the years that followed, both men settled into their respective corners. Their friendship soured. They barely spoke to one another. The medium that started the rift? Annie Brittain. I'm Jennifer Beck, and this is The Haunted Hustle. But she never intended for things to work out that way. Annie Brittain was born Annie Arnold in the winter of 1880 in Stanley, West Yorkshire, the eldest of 8 children. Like many, her childhood was profoundly shaped by death and change, marked by a unique blend of fascination and exposure to the paranormal. With the loss of so many on the battlefield and the devastating impact of the 1918 influenza pandemic, a profound sense of grief and loss gripped the nation. Traditional religion failed to provide satisfactory answers for many in the face of such monumental tragedies. Some even took the cruel stance that the wars were just and the pandemics were divine punishment. But the era was also marked by a rapid and astonishing surge in technological innovation. The boundaries between scientific marvels and the supernatural blurred. Electricity and radio emerged, and with it, the ability to hear voices from afar, seemingly materializing out of thin air. Driven by a host of scientists and intellectuals, technology continued to explode, further transforming the unimaginable into reality. It became an age where the miraculous and scientific often appeared intertwined, and suddenly, the idea of communication across the realm of the dead didn't seem entirely implausible. In its wake, the allure of psychic phenomena, and particularly spirit communication, captivated the minds and imagination of the country. Spiritualism, the burgeoning religion that professed the dead could and would communicate with the living, exploded. Countless individuals turned to mediums, seances, and store-bought Ouija boards to not only alleviate their grief, but defy death itself. As a young girl, Annie was immersed in a world where seances, spirit communication, and other supernatural phenomena were commonplace. It was not uncommon for families to engage in seances or attend gatherings where mediums purported to communicate with the spirits. She likely found herself surrounded by discussions of the occult, the mysterious and unexplained, sparking her curiosity and sowing the seeds of her eventual involvement. The spiritualist movement also encouraged a sense of community and support among its followers. For Annie, growing up in an environment where people sought solace, answers, and a connection, instilled in her a deep empathy and a desire to help. But a little backstory didn't hurt either. As she told Conan Doyle for his book, The History of Spiritualism, her psychic gifts were evident in childhood, and she was said to have played with spirit children and gone into trances. She used these same claims to gain the approval of her parents as well. She claimed to have made the acquaintance of the ghost of Sicily, her mother's old school friend, and she had been particularly successful in playground games of fortune-telling when she was still at school. Of course, none of this can be verified. It would be hard for any parent to distinguish between spectral interaction and imaginary friends. But unlike other mediums who claimed similar experiences, her parents appear to have believed and supported her gifts. Records show the family relocated to Longton, a notable spiritualist boomtown, where contemporary newspapers report she became a member of the Longton Spiritualist Church around 1895. In later years, Annie said her parents converted too. Being raised spiritualist, the rest of Annie's upbringing seems quite normal, and she grew up to be a psychic and trance medium. Her success due to her remarkable ability to deceive sitters through mentalism, a performance art similar to stage magic. Instead of tricking the audience by exploiting physical quirks and limitations, mentalists manipulate psychological traits and the powers of the mind. Sitters were thrilled by her uncanny skills of precognition, the ability to foretell the future, retrocognition, the ability to recall facts one would have no way of knowing, and psychometry, the ability to derive information through contact with an associated object. To accomplish this, Annie relied on a combination of techniques, using past knowledge to give hot reads, nonverbal cues for cold reads, and Barnum statements, vague reflections that, when delivered properly, feel like personal revelations. She also used other tactics to plant ideas in sitters' subconscious minds. Tactics like scenery manipulation, wardrobe alteration, and specific words casually inserted in small talk encouraged participants to believe they had communed with the dead. She also employed fishing, asking seemingly innocuous questions to extract information, enhancing the illusion. Her sitter's psychological state also played a pivotal role. Shock, stress, and grief profoundly affected their focus and memory, making them more susceptible to suggestion and manipulation. While the art had been around for a while, famed mentalist Alexander was at the height of his career at the same time, spiritualists, sitters, and psychic researchers believed Annie's gifts were real. To them, the idea of a woman being capable of such feats were absurd. It made far more sense that her talents were bestowed upon her from beyond the grave. Should we blame her for that? Aside from the fees she charged, which were in accordance with demand, Annie was never particularly greedy, nor was she ever accused of stealing from her clients. No doubt she was a talented, imaginative woman who took the limited advantages society afforded her and used them to her advantage. But does this make her a villain? As she improved, her seances evolved into dramatic theater. Under the flicker of candlelight, sitters said she would lower her head and enter a trance, allowing her body to be taken over by a spirit guide named Belle. Belle, she claimed, was from Sri Lanka, which she said explained her high-pitched voice and twittering falsetto, qualities that many would say didn't age well. But to her audience, this was significant. Plenty of mediums had spirit guides, but having one from such a foreign, exotic land boosted Annie's street cred. It was generally believed by American and European believers that the Far East had a closer connection to the spirit realm, and therefore generated much better guides. Of course, this was only a rumor, but one that didn't hurt either. To hit the idea of her possession home, Annie played the role of Belle as if she were an entirely different person. She adopted different characteristics and mannerisms and created an imaginary boundary between she and her supposed specters. When she emerged, her audience would be astounded, furthering her reputation. She also threw in a little telekinesis, just for kicks, using the tools employed by other mediums with similar shticks. Magnets, hidden levers, cabinets, curtains, and accomplices. Coupled with dimly lit parlors, they created believable illusions that appeared real. During one of these seances, future medium Fanny Higginson, then a 14-year-old child, received a premonition from her. According to Fanny, Annie said she would have a son who would go on to be a world-famous medium. Even more shocking, Annie said she received this information from the spirit of Fanny's mother. Having only spoken to her mother an hour earlier, Fanny was in disbelief. But when the child rushed home, she learned her mother had indeed died unexpectedly of a sudden brain hemorrhage. She and her son would go on to fill significant roles in the history of spiritualism. Stay tuned. Annie's life took another significant turn when she met Frederick Brittain, a man whose interests and beliefs complemented her own. He had strong ties to the area, possibly being raised there, and records suggest he had also had an early associations with the church. His primary occupation was listed as an engineering pattern maker in Nottingham, but in business advertisements, he claimed to be a magnetic healer, an alternative medicine theory that focused on manipulating of unseen bodily energies for the purpose of healing and well-being. 5 years her senior, he recognized the advantages of a relationship with Annie. She was good for business. His practice aligned remarkably well with hers. Their shared interests undoubtedly made her even more attractive. Her reputation and spiritualist pedigree signaled credibility and a public endorsement. Her circle of acquaintances opened doors, providing opportunities he might not otherwise have. Their romance progressed quickly. The couple married in June 1904, their union marked by the birth of their son the following November. I'll let you do the math. The young family made their home in Nottingham, but maintained the headquarters of their business, Brittain's Psychic Institutes, in Longton, making monthly visits. Together, the power couple formed a dynamic partnership of metaphysical and spiritual practices where they would dominate spiritual services, combining Frederick's magnetic healing with Annie's clairvoyance. By all accounts, it doesn't appear that Annie had any nefarious intentions. She was ambitious, yes, and eager to please her husband and business partner, as well as do her part to support her growing family. Still, not all of this was her fault. As we will see, there's plenty of blame to go around. Annie's seances held a particular blend of fascination and spiritual comfort for her clients, and soon garnered attention from the Society of Psychic Research. Researchers with the collective reached out to request a study. While the possibility of being investigated may seem like a deterrent today, mediums of the day jumped at the chance. The fact that they were approached at all was validation of their talents and another accolade to add to their resume. These researchers also paid handsomely for the medium's time, as well as any expenses she cared to negotiate. They were also overwhelming believers, so the chances of the study becoming repeat business was high. Plus, if they pulled it off and they were able to fool the testers, what a high! Judging from records of their early investigations, the SPR wasn't interested in mom-and-pop grief journeys, but rather those of the upper elite class. And it's safe to say Annie, like other mediums of the day, was too. Wealthier clients can pay heftier fees. Her clients came from the upper echelons of British society, including influential writers, politicians, and cultural influencers. But important people weren't crazy about having their interactions observed by eggheads with notebooks. So Annie told them if they wanted to document her gifts, they would have to interview her clients themselves. Like socialite Etta Hyatt, on March 19, 1917, her fiancé, Royal Flying Corps Captain Eldred Wolferston Boyer Bower, was reported missing. His remains were recovered later that month. During a séance, Annie claimed Eldred's sister had communicated with him. Well, sort of. Eager to see if this was true, Etta reached out to his half-sister who was in India at the time. Upon hearing the shocking revelations, she shared that same month, while caring for her newborn, she saw Eldred. He was smiling and at peace. Before she could embrace him, he vanished. Initially, she told Etta she thought it was a trick of the mind, but based on the medium's claims, she was convinced it had to be a genuine visitation, especially as it had occurred so close to her baby's christening. She'd even written about it in her diary, but never shared it, especially not with her skeptical husband. He wasn't a spiritualist, after all, and she was sure he would dismiss it as nonsense. Upon hearing the anecdote, the Society for Psychic Research documented the story, citing the same emotionally suspect details to declare it credible. More so, that tale and others like it were used to declare her the real deal, without a shred of proof anything was true. It was like hearing the cure for the plague from a presidential celebrity. And we already know where that gets us. But not everyone was convinced. As Annie's prominence continued to rise, so did the number of scandals. On August 22, 1907, she and two other women, a palmist and a card reader, were arrested and charged with unlawfully pretending to tell fortunes to deceive. The allegation stemmed from a sting orchestrated by the wives of two policemen who visited the women undercover. In Annie's case, she'd incorrectly estimated the age of one of the operative's mothers and was accused of providing fraudulent readings. In a separate notation, which sounds a little more like a breach of contract, they also complained the clairvoyant readings hadn't included other thrilling elements they'd expected. There's just no pleasing some people. During the trial in mid-September, Annie's defense argued that the case was not strong enough to warrant conviction, and the charges were eventually dropped. Her co-defendants weren't so lucky. The palmist was given a £10 fine plus court costs with the threat of 2 months in prison if she couldn't pay. And the card reader was fined 40 shillings along with costs and a similar threat of nearly a month. Despite the controversy surrounding her arrest and subsequent proceedings, Annie's legal troubles didn't impact her reputation in the spiritualist community. Her career continued to flourish, and those attempting to tarnish her reputation hardly succeeded in making a dent. Frederick placed several advertisements in the Staffordshire Sentinel promoting her services and lectures. She was even invited to deliver a talk on spirit people at the prestigious King Edward Hall in Hanley. A very big deal. But in October 1915, she found herself entangled in another legal predicament and another criminal sting. This time, the circumstances would have a lasting impact. Two women, Miss Emma Brown and Miss Fanny Pickford, were sent by local police to seek fortunes and predictions. During her seance, Annie placed Emma's glove under a crystal and proclaimed that her husband had not been wounded in the war at all, but had experienced a nervous breakdown. She also said her mother-in-law had not approved of her son's marriage, a statement Emma later admitted was true, but was also common knowledge to anyone who knew her. In Fanny's case, Annie predicted her husband would suffer grave wounds in France and return a mentally changed man. But Fanny refuted this. as her husband was unharmed and due to return the following week. Another participant, a farmer named Bowler, also visited Annie. He received warnings not to associate with a horse dealer named Sam, a piece of advice that didn't sit well with him. Because he wasn't really a farmer. He was a police officer dressed in disguise. Once again, Annie was arrested and charged with fraud. During the trial, her solicitor argued that she had complete faith in her abilities and genuinely believed her clairvoyant powers to be real. She had no real intention to deceive. Citing her husband's employment and the lifestyle they afforded their family, he asserted she had no real need for the money. And for the most part, that was true. But the magistrate was unconvinced and ruled that she did indeed commit a crime, using her examinations of Emma's glove as proof. She was fined £5 and 5 shillings and court costs. While the conviction was minor, its potential damage to her credibility was concerning. Not only did it give her detractors ammunition in their campaign of further scrutiny, it had the potential to foster skepticism among her customer base. To be seen as a fraud would ruin her. As Maggie Fox amply showed us in an earlier episode, you can't command upper-tier prices with a low-cred act. Publicly, Annie and Frederick didn't show any sign of being affected by the conviction, maintaining a proper British stiff upper lip. Despite the scandal, they managed to maintain their lifestyle. Overall, it didn't appear to have affected their finances. They continued to maintain ownership of 2 houses and employment of a domestic servant. But contemporary records suggest a different story. The 1911 census didn't list an occupation for Annie at all. Still, the couple decided to make a fresh start by relocating from Henley to London. And for the next couple of years, Annie embarked on a public relations tour. She traveled to spiritualist churches across the country, gradually gaining notoriety. By all accounts, it was a success. By 1913, her advertisements proudly referred to her as England's premier clairvoyant, a title that served to crowd out any critics and doubts. And she switched things up, targeting more feminine clients by advertising seances with tea. Her reputation reached such heights that renowned physicist and spiritualist researcher Sir Oliver Lodge sought her out for a sitting. After his son Raymond's tragic death at the front, Lodge attended Annie's seances at Stoke-on-Trent and was delighted with her uncanny abilities. He was so impressed that he referred her to his other spiritualist colleagues, like Arthur Conan Doyle, who began consulting with Annie after the death of his son and brother. During her first sitting, she conveyed a message from his son, assuring him he was content and at peace, a message the author swore came from his own voice. At another, his son's spirit said he and Doyle's brother were reunited in the afterlife. By his third visit, he was completely convinced. Profoundly moved, Conan Doyle began calling her his favorite medium. This might have been enough to jettison her career into an entirely new level. But soon, Annie faced new challenges. Desperate to win the war, the government had changed recruiting tactics and was actively encouraging married men to enlist. When Frederick heeded the call, Annie was left alone to manage their household and business on her own. She continued to practice her mediumship and gave birth to their second son, John, in early 1917. By his first birthday, Mom Boss was promoting herself as the renowned London medium. In an effort to convert his friend, Harry Houdini, to spiritualism, Conan Doyle arranged for Annie to hold a seance for him and his wife. The referral was a big deal. An endorsement from Houdini, the world's most famous illusionist and spiritualist foil, would have been a significant achievement, the triumph of a lifetime. But to her chagrin, Houdini would walk away with his opinions intact. Aware of his deep grief over the loss of his mother, Annie knew very little else. The general lackluster quality of her performance could be explained by an overconfidence in her mentalist abilities. Perhaps she bit off a little more than she could chew. But it's also just as possible that, aware of Houdini's little hobby, she froze. Their contrasting views on Annie and spiritualism ultimately strained their once close friendship. As a result, both dug in their heels. Conan Doyle accused Houdini of being conceited and self-opinionated. Houdini considered Conan Doyle senile and gullible. After her failure, Annie decided to enlist her sister Nellie as an accomplice and doubled down on the press releases. In one of her more notable ones, the women claimed a photograph of their deceased brother mysteriously appeared in a locked room, accompanied by a message written in chalk. According to their self-reports, they initially suspected Frederick or one of the kids of playing a prank. But the photograph appeared again with a new message, at a time when neither Frederick nor the children were around. They knew they had to go public. Spiritualist magazines were quick to publish the story, but unfortunately, skeptic journals quickly did the same. Their claims didn't appear to have affected business either way, but it did quiet coverage of Houdini's findings. So there was that. As the mid-1920s arrived, the Victorian-era fascination with the Gothic and communicating with the dead began to give way to new ideas and cultural trends. The emotional temperature of the nation began to shift. The overwhelming grief brought on by the First World War waned, and with it, so did Annie's career. She did the best to make it work. She continued to make appearances, showcasing her abilities. She also made herself more available to the psychic researchers she once blew off. At one point, conducting a seance for the SPR, where she reportedly channeled the spirit of a prominent newspaper baron. Courting the media always helps. Over the next decade, the dedication of her detractors died down. She continued to work, but the public seemed less interested. In spite of it, Lodge and Conan Doyle remained steadfast. In 1928, she was featured prominently in the quarterly publication of the British College of Psychic Sciences, a similarly declining group in which the author served as president. The article gave a glowing account of Annie's life and career, but garnered no more from the public than a yawn. In 1935, she decided to try her hand at writing herself, publishing the book *Twixt Earth and Heaven*. The book was a blend of anecdotes and self-help. In addition to retelling many of her previous stories, Annie wrote the purpose of one's life was to improve themselves so they might cross to a higher plane of existence. And maybe that was her objective all along, to bring up the broken-hearted people who came to her. When he returned, she and Frederick moved to a cottage in Banstead, where she seemed to have retreated into a quiet life, content to support her husband. A 1939 register lists her profession as a homemaker. Frederick is described as an author and lecturer. Though there's no evidence he ever wrote a book, much less ever said he did, so perhaps the interviewing official made the assumption that writing at a certain level involved a penis and gave him credit instead. Annie further retreated from the spotlight when he died in 1941. Without any real reason to keep going, she stopped traveling for lectures and appearances, opting to focus on her family. Unlike other mediums, she never recanted her claims. In later years, she continued to do readings and sittings, but only on a small scale. She died at home in Surrey in the spring of 1969. She was 89 years old. Stay tuned after the break for more about Harry Houdini's seance antics. In his later years, Harry Houdini planned a historic escape act that had never been attempted. But it wouldn't go down as his greatest stunt in life. This one, in fact, would wait until after his death. To finally prove once and for all if the souls of the dead could contact the living, he and his wife Bess agreed that when he died, she would hold a seance on the anniversary of his passing and he would deliver a message. A code known only to her. The message they devised was, Rosabelle, answer, tell, pray, answer, look, tell, answer, tell. The first word was a reference to a song Bess sung in her vaudeville act when the two first met. The remainder, when deciphered, spelled out the word believe. If the contact was legitimate, the message would be received. Its proof would be undeniable. Consequently, the same conclusion could be drawn if otherwise. Houdini died at a Detroit hospital on October 31, 1926, from complications of appendicitis and peritonitis brought on by an incident days earlier when a misguided fan delivered several forcible blows to the star's abdomen. True to their pact, Bess held a seance each year. After failing to receive the words for a decade, she ended the practice, stating, "10 years is long enough to wait for any man." She wasn't disappointed. It was certainly how Houdini expected it to go. This has been The Haunted Hustle. Thanks for listening. The Haunted Hustle is an original production of Toil and Trouble Media. Executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Erin Iris, and our music was by Kevin MacLeod, Light Saturation, and the Schizoid Nightmares. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed our podcast, and I really hope you do, be sure to subscribe to your favorite podcast provider and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. And give us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Heck, give us a 5-star rating on all of them. We can use all the stars we can get. And help us spread the word. Tell your friends about our show and its totally bingeable content. Tell your spirit guides too. We're not picky. And if you want to help us bring even more Toil and Trouble to the world, check out our merch and our Patreon pages. We have a link at toilandtroublemedia.com, or you can find it on Patreon itself. Just look for a sign. Well, it's the owl, but close enough. And as always, thanks for listening.